I came across something a while back that I have not been able to stop thinking about. It was not in a documentary or a podcast or any of the usual places you would expect to find something that changes the way you look at a piece of history. It was in an old academic paper about medieval farming techniques. The author was describing the heavy plough, a piece of agricultural technology that spread across northern Europe sometime around the 7th or 8th century. And he made an offhand observation that stopped me cold. He noted that the heavy plough required a team of 8 oxen to pull it. No single peasant family could afford 8 oxen. So communities had to pool their animals, which meant reorganizing the way land was divided, which changed the physical layout of villages, which altered social hierarchies, which eventually influenced the development of local governance and law across an entire continent. All of that from a plough. And the author added, almost as an aside, that this transformation happened during the period most people still refer to as the Dark Ages, a time, supposedly, when nothing of significance was happening in Europe, when the continent had sunk into an intellectual and cultural void, when the lights went out and stayed out for 1,000 years. That contrast sat with me for days. On one side, there is this label we have all inherited, the Dark Ages, a phrase that summons images of stagnation, superstition, civilizational blackout. On the other, there is a continent being quietly restructured from the soil up by a single change in how people broke the ground. A change that demanded new social arrangements, new concepts of shared property, new forms of cooperation. Those two pictures do not belong in the same frame. And once you notice the contradiction, you start noticing it everywhere. So tonight I want to sit with that. Not to debunk a myth or champion an era or build a case for prosecution. Just to look, carefully and without hurry, at what actually happened during those centuries, and perhaps more importantly, to understand why the story we were told about them took the particular shape it did. Because the more I looked into it, the more I realized the interesting question is not whether the Dark Ages were truly dark. The interesting question is why that specific word, dark, attached itself to those specific centuries. Who coined it? Who promoted it? Who kept it in circulation? And what every one of them got out of it. Let us take it slowly. There is a lot of ground to cover, and none of it is as simple as it appears at first. The phrase has an origin, and the origin tells you more than you might expect. It begins with a man named Petrarch, an Italian scholar and poet born in 1304. Petrarch was, by the standards of his time, something of a literary romantic. He loved the writers of ancient Rome with the kind of devotion that other people reserved for saints. He adored Cicero's prose, Virgil's poetry, Seneca's philosophy. He collected their manuscripts obsessively. He even wrote letters addressed to Cicero, letters he knew would never be read, simply to practice the cadences of classical Latin and to feel, however briefly, as though he were part of that earlier world. And he looked around at the literary culture of his own 14th century and found it wanting. The Latin being written in his day felt stiff, formulaic, graceless. The classical tradition, which he believed represented the highest achievement of the human mind, had been neglected and debased over the intervening centuries. So he drew a line through history. Everything before Rome's fall was light. Everything after was shadow. A period of diminished radiance. That was the original complaint. Not that people had been oppressed, not that the church had destroyed knowledge, not that civilization had gone to sleep, simply that the quality of Latin prose had declined. Petrarch was, at heart, a man who felt the writing had gotten worse. But ideas do not stay tethered to the people who introduce them. They drift, they mutate, they get adopted by people with entirely different purposes. And Petrarch's metaphor of light and darkness was too potent, too emotionally satisfying, too useful to remain a mere literary complaint. Over the following centuries, it was picked up and inflated far beyond anything Petrarch had intended. In the 16th century, Protestant reformers found the term useful because it helped them frame the medieval church as a corrupt institution that had kept people in spiritual darkness, justifying the break they were making with Rome. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Enlightenment thinkers went further still. They turned the Middle Ages into a cautionary tale about what happens when religious authority replaces rational inquiry, when superstition displaces science, when dogma smothers curiosity. The darkness was no longer just a comment about literary quality. It was a civilizational indictment, a verdict on an entire millennium. By the 19th century, this inflated version of Petrarch's metaphor had hardened into the standard narrative taught in schools, printed in textbooks, and absorbed by millions of children across Europe and the Americas. Greece and Rome, bright and brilliant. Then a long fall into darkness. Then the Renaissance, a glorious reawakening. Then the Enlightenment. Then the Industrial Age. Then us. It is an enormously satisfying structure. It has symmetry. It has a clear moral lesson. And it carries a deeply flattering implication, which is that the modern world represents the natural and perhaps inevitable triumph of reason over ignorance. That we are the light. That the darkness is behind us. That the arrow of history points in one direction. The trouble is, the story does not match the evidence, and the more carefully you examine the centuries it dismisses, the more the neat structure buckles. Let me start with what was genuinely lost when Rome collapsed, because something real and significant did happen. I want to be honest about that before we go any further. When the Western Roman Empire ceased to function as a political entity around 476 AD, the consequences were enormous and lasting. The administrative system that had coordinated activity across a territory stretching from Britain to North Africa simply stopped working. The road network, one of the most remarkable engineering projects the ancient world ever produced, began to deteriorate without the centralized maintenance it required. Long-distance trade became slower, more expensive, and more dangerous. Urban populations declined, sometimes dramatically. Cities that had been thriving centers of commerce and culture became, within a few generations, diminished settlements surrounded by overgrown ruins. The education system collapsed along with everything else. In the Roman world, there had been a broad culture of literacy among the governing and merchant classes. Not universal literacy by any means, but a shared expectation that people of a certain social standing would be able to read, write, and engage with classical texts. Schools existed in cities across the empire, supported not by the state in any modern sense, but by the economic prosperity and cultural habits of urban life. When the economic foundation crumbled, the schools crumbled with it. And without schools, literacy rates dropped steadily and quietly across the continent. Think about what that means in practice. In the 2nd century, a reasonably well-off Roman in Gaul could write a letter to a friend in Egypt and have a reasonable expectation that it would arrive, be read, and receive a reply. He could buy a book. He could consult a doctor who had been trained in a tradition stretching back to Hippocrates. He could access legal advice grounded in a body of law that was the same in Londinium as in Alexandria. He lived within a system. By the 6th century, much of that system was gone. Not everywhere and not all at once. But in large parts of what had been the Western Empire, the web of connections that had made civilization feel continuous had torn apart. A person in one region could live an entire lifetime without encountering a book, without meeting anyone who could read, without any reliable connection to the intellectual tradition of their own civilization. The knowledge had not been erased from the world, but it had been effectively erased from their world. There is a kind of loss that does not make for dramatic storytelling. No fire, no decree of destruction, no villain, just a slow, generational process of disconnection. The roads get worse. The traders come less often. The teacher gets old and dies, and no one replaces her. The last copy of a manuscript sits on a shelf in a room that no one visits, and eventually the damp and the mice do what deliberate destruction never needed to. But the thing that is usually lost in the popular telling of this story is the specific nature of what was lost. It was not, in most cases, knowledge in the abstract. It was not as though people woke up one morning and had forgotten how to think. What collapsed was the system that allowed knowledge to circulate, to be shared, compared, tested, and built upon across large distances. Consider a practical example. Imagine a skilled glassmaker in 6th century Syria who understood how to produce a certain kind of colored glass that was prized throughout the old Roman world. After the empire's collapse, that glassmaker still knew how to do his work, but the trade routes that had carried his products to Gaul, to Britain, to the Danube provinces were disrupted or gone. The ships were fewer. The buyers were fewer. The apprentices who might have learned from him and carried the technique to other regions were fewer. And so the knowledge persisted locally, in one workshop, in one lifetime, and when that workshop closed, the technique faded. Not because it was suppressed, not because anyone forbade it, because the conditions that had allowed it to spread and reproduce were no longer present. Multiply this by thousands of trades, techniques, and traditions across a continent, and you begin to understand the real texture of what happened after Rome. It was not a dramatic burning of knowledge. It was a slow failure of transmission, the quiet breaking of 1,000 small chains of apprenticeship, of trade, of conversation between distant practitioners. Knowledge did not explode and disappear. It contracted. It became local, isolated, and fragile. This distinction matters because it reshapes the question. The popular version asks, who destroyed the knowledge? The more accurate version asks, what happened to the systems that kept knowledge alive? And the answer to that second question leads directly to the church. Not because the church destroyed those systems, but because it was the only large-scale institution that survived to build something in their place. The church's position in the post-Roman world was unlike anything that had existed before. It was not a government. It did not command armies in the conventional sense. It did not collect taxes or maintain roads. But it possessed something that, in the aftermath of the empire's collapse, turned out to be remarkably powerful. It had an institutional network. The monasteries that spread across Europe from the 6th century onward were connected to each other by shared belief, shared language, shared ritual, and a shared institutional hierarchy. A Benedictine monk in Ireland and a Benedictine monk in southern Italy followed the same daily schedule, prayed in the same language, read from the same texts, and answered, however indirectly, to the same institutional authority. In a world where virtually every other large-scale social structure had fragmented along regional lines, this continuity was extraordinary. The monasteries became the nodes of a new kind of network, not political, not commercial, cultural. They were the places where books were kept, where literacy was taught, where the slow, patient work of copying manuscripts was carried out. And this copying work, which might sound routine, turned out to be one of the most consequential acts of preservation in human history. Every text that survived the early Middle Ages survived because someone copied it by hand. There was no other way. Printing would not exist in Europe for another 7 or 8 centuries. Each copy was produced on expensive parchment with hand-mixed ink in rooms that were often cold and poorly lit. A single book could take months. A large work could take years. The scribes were monks whose primary obligation was to their spiritual life, not to scholarship. The time they spent in the scriptorium was time carved out of a daily schedule that centered on prayer, manual labor, and worship. That they persisted in this work for centuries, across generations, through wars and famines and institutional upheavals, is genuinely remarkable. And the result was the survival of an enormous body of classical literature, philosophy, and science that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The works of Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, much of Aristotle, fragments of Plato, the medical writings of Galen, pieces of Roman law and engineering knowledge. All of this reached the modern world through the hands of medieval monks. We owe them a great deal, and acknowledging that debt is important before we examine the other side of the equation. Because the other side is this: the monks did not copy everything. They could not have, even with unlimited time and resources. And they did not have unlimited time or resources. Parchment was expensive, the work was grueling, and the monks had to make choices about what was worth the effort. Those choices were guided by their values. And their values were, naturally and inevitably, the values of their faith. Theological texts, biblical commentaries, liturgical writings, hagiographies, these were copied as a matter of course. They were the bread and butter of monastic intellectual life. Classical texts were also preserved, but selectively. Works that could be reconciled with Christian thought, or that were considered useful for developing skills in rhetoric, logic, and grammar, the tools of theological argumentation, were more likely to make the cut. Works that dealt with materialist philosophy, pagan religion, sexual morality in ways the church found objectionable, or natural science that contradicted doctrinal positions were less likely to be reproduced. In some cases, the parchment of older manuscripts was scraped clean and reused for new religious texts, a practice so widespread that it has its own name, palimpsest. This process was not, in most instances, a deliberate campaign of censorship. There was no committee reviewing manuscripts and issuing verdicts. It was something quieter, more diffuse, and in the long run more effective than any deliberate campaign could have been. It was a system of priorities operating over centuries. Think about how institutional priorities work in any context. If you run a library with limited shelf space, you keep the books that align with your mission, and you let the others go. If you run a university with limited funding, you support the departments that serve your goals, and you allow others to shrink. No one needs to declare war on the defunded department. It just gradually fades from institutional memory. Over 5 years, the effect is barely noticeable. Over 50, it changes the landscape. Over 500, it reshapes an entire civilization's relationship with its own intellectual heritage. That is what happened. The body of knowledge that emerged from the medieval monasteries was real, extensive, and genuinely valuable. But it was also, inescapably, a curated body of knowledge. The priorities of the people who did the curating left their mark on what survived. Certain philosophical traditions, the Greek atomists, the more radical strands of Hellenistic materialism, some schools of medical thought, were thinned to near extinction. Not because anyone declared them dangerous in a dramatic fashion, because they simply did not make the cut, over and over, for century after century. The narrowing was deepened by a second factor that is easy to overlook, but that shaped the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe just as profoundly. Language. In the Roman world, Latin was a living language. People spoke it at home, in the marketplace, in the courts, in the army. Children grew up hearing it. It was the shared medium of an entire civilization. But after the empire dissolved, spoken Latin splintered. The dialects of different regions diverged from each other and from the formal written language over the course of a few centuries, becoming the separate Romance languages we know today: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. By the 8th or 9th century, a farmer in what is now France and a farmer in what is now Spain could not understand each other's speech, and neither of them could read the Latin in the books on the monastery shelves. The Church maintained Latin as the language of worship, scholarship, and institutional communication. It was a formalized, conservative, deliberately preserved version of the language, quite different from what the Romans had actually spoken in daily life. And because virtually all preserved knowledge was recorded in this Church Latin, and because the Church was the only institution that systematically taught it, the ability to access the accumulated learning of the Western world was, in practice, restricted to people who had passed through the Church's educational pipeline. The implications of this were enormous and are, I think, underappreciated. Imagine a person in 9th century England with an extraordinary mind. One of those people who, in a different context, might have become a philosopher, an inventor, a physician, a mathematician. Unless that person entered a religious community, there was no path to literacy, no way to learn to read, no access to any book. The knowledge was there. It physically existed, written on parchment, sitting on shelves, sometimes only a day's journey away. But it was written in a language this person did not speak, kept in a building this person could not enter, maintained by an institution that admitted only those who committed their lives to it. This is not the same thing as knowledge being destroyed. It is something subtler and in some ways more durable. It is knowledge being made structurally inaccessible to the overwhelming majority of the population. Not by a wall of fire or a decree of prohibition, but by a wall of language and a gate of institutional membership. And the institution that held the key to that gate was the same institution that decided what new knowledge would be produced, what questions could be asked, and what answers would be tolerated. When people speak of the Dark Ages as a time of ignorance, they are, in a sense, describing something real. But the ignorance was not a natural condition. It was, to a significant degree, a structural one, produced not by the absence of knowledge, but by the conditions under which knowledge was stored, accessed, and transmitted. All of this converges on a single underlying reality that runs through the entire history of the so-called Dark Ages. And it is this: for roughly 7 or 8 centuries, the written record of Western European civilization was produced, preserved, and controlled by one institution. The chronicles, the annals, the histories, the legal documents, the letters between rulers, the accounts of wars and treaties and famines. Almost everything we know about the early Middle Ages was written by clergy, not because ordinary people had nothing to say, but because ordinary people overwhelmingly could not write. Literacy was concentrated in the monasteries, and to some extent in the courts of kings, who employed churchmen as secretaries and administrators. This shapes the record in ways that are fundamental, but easy to miss if you are not looking for them. When you read a medieval chronicle, you are not reading an objective account of events. You are reading one institution's version of events, composed by a member of that institution, using the categories and assumptions of that institution, and preserved because the institution saw value in preserving it. The perspective of farmers, craftsmen, women, children, non-Christians, religious dissenters, merchants, travelers. All of it is almost entirely absent from the surviving written record of the early Middle Ages. Not because these people did not exist or did not have lives and experiences worth recording, but because the institution that controlled the means of recording did not, in most cases, see those lives as worth the parchment. And here lies one of the deepest ironies of the Dark Ages label. The era is called dark, partly because the historical record is so thin, but the thinness of the record is not evidence that nothing happened. It is evidence that the people doing the recording had a particular perspective and particular priorities. They wrote about what mattered to them, which was the life of the church, the actions of kings and bishops, the spread of the faith, the moral meaning of events within a Christian theological framework. Everything else, the vast, teeming, complicated everyday life of an entire continent, was largely invisible to their lens. The darkness, in other words, is not in the era. It is in the record, and the record reflects not the whole of reality, but one institution's window onto it. Now, when people first encounter this line of reasoning, some of them leap to a dramatic conclusion. They decide that the church deliberately suppressed knowledge, deliberately fabricated history, deliberately held the continent in darkness to consolidate power. And the standard academic response is to say that this is a gross oversimplification, that the church was actually a patron of learning, that the monks preserved far more than they destroyed, and that the real picture is nuanced. Both responses contain truth, and both are incomplete in ways that matter. The church did not set out to create an age of darkness. The monks who copied manuscripts were genuinely trying to preserve what they believed was valuable. The bishops who built cathedral schools were genuinely trying to educate. The theologians who spent their lives wrestling with Aristotle and Plato were genuinely trying to understand the deepest questions of human existence. These were not, as a class, people acting in bad faith. But institutions develop their own logic, and the logic of any institution that holds a monopoly on a vital resource, whether that resource is literacy, information, education, or spiritual authority, tends naturally toward the regulation and control of that resource, not because the individuals involved are malicious, but because monopolies behave like monopolies. You do not need bad people to produce bad outcomes. You need only a structural arrangement in which one entity controls something that everyone else needs, and there is no countervailing power to check or balance it. For centuries, the Church was the only institution in Western Europe that produced literate people, that stored books, that trained scholars, that approved topics of inquiry. You did not need to actively suppress anything in that environment. You simply set the terms. You defined what was acceptable. You funded what aligned with your mission. And everything outside those boundaries, without anyone needing to ban it or burn it, gradually lost its support, its practitioners, and its place in the culture. This is the mechanism that is so easy to miss and so important to understand. The narrowing of the intellectual landscape during the early Middle Ages was not mainly a product of spectacular acts of destruction. It was a product of ordinary institutional behavior, replicated across hundreds of communities, over hundreds of years, with perfect consistency. The accumulated effect was enormous, but the individual steps were, for the most part, unremarkable. It may help to see how this dynamic played out in specific cases, because the abstract version can make it seem like something that only matters to historians. It is not. The effects shaped the world we inherited. Consider the Bible itself. The text that became the foundation of Christian civilization did not arrive in its current form spontaneously. It was assembled through a long process of deliberation and selection, conducted over the first several centuries of Christianity at a series of church councils. There were, in the early Christian world, far more Gospels, letters, apocalypses, and wisdom texts in circulation than eventually made it into the official canon. Dozens of writings that various Christian communities considered sacred and authoritative were reviewed, debated, and ultimately set aside. The texts that were excluded, the ones we now group loosely under the label Apocrypha or non-canonical writings, are fascinating not because they contain hidden scandals, but because they reveal the range of early Christian thought. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, presents Jesus primarily as a teacher of wisdom, offering sayings and parables that emphasize inner transformation rather than institutional obedience. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene depicts a woman as a central spiritual authority in the early community. The Book of Enoch describes a cosmology that includes angelic hierarchies and cosmic cycles of destruction and renewal. Other excluded texts contained elements of Gnostic philosophy, mystical speculation, or alternative accounts of creation. The church councils that finalized the canon did not claim these texts were false. They classified them as non-authoritative, not suitable for public reading in churches, not to be used as the basis for doctrine. Over time, the distinction between non-authoritative and forbidden blurred. In some periods, possessing certain excluded texts could be treated as evidence of heresy. What matters for our purposes is the principle at work. An institution decided which texts would form the intellectual and spiritual foundation for an entire civilization, and which texts would be withdrawn from circulation. That decision was not arbitrary. It was the product of genuine theological reasoning, but it was also, inevitably, an act of institutional authority. It defined the range of acceptable thought. It set the boundaries within which a continent would operate, spiritually and intellectually, for 1,000 years. The same pattern repeated in other areas. When Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, His work was initially tolerated, in part because it was framed as a mathematical convenience rather than a claim about physical reality. When Galileo began arguing that the model described the actual structure of the cosmos, the institutional response sharpened. He was tried, forced to recant, and spent his remaining years under house arrest. The issue was not that the Church lacked people capable of understanding the evidence. It was that the evidence, if accepted, would have required revising a whole architecture of theological commitments about humanity's place in the divine order. And for an institution whose authority rested on that architecture, the revision felt like a threat. Giordano Bruno, a generation before Galileo, went further. He proposed an infinite universe containing innumerable worlds, and he drew philosophical conclusions from this that the Church found intolerable. He was imprisoned for 8 years and burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. His case involved more than cosmology. There were personal and theological disputes as well. But at its core, it illustrated the same pattern. When inquiry leads to conclusions that challenge the framework on which institutional authority depends, the institution's first impulse is often not to engage the conclusions, but to silence the person who drew them. These episodes are often cited to paint the Church as an enemy of all knowledge. That is too simple. The Church funded, supported, and participated in enormous amounts of intellectual work. Robert Grosseteste made real contributions to optics and scientific method. Roger Bacon wrote about experimentation and mathematics with genuine sophistication. Thomas Aquinas produced one of the most intricate philosophical systems in Western history. The Church was not ignorant, it was selective. And selectivity, when exercised by a monopoly over long periods of time, produces results that are structurally similar to suppression, even when the intention is quite different. The tension was never between knowledge and ignorance. It was between knowledge that served the institution and knowledge that did not. And the institution's definition of what served it was, over time, the most powerful force shaping the intellectual landscape of an entire civilization. The narrowing becomes even more striking when you look at what was happening in the rest of the world during the same centuries. While Western Europe's intellectual life was operating within the boundaries set by the Church, the Islamic world was experiencing one of the most expansive intellectual periods in human history. The city of Baghdad, founded in 762, became the largest and most intellectually vibrant city on earth. At its peak, in the 9th century, it was home to well over 1 million people. Its scholars were not merely preserving ancient Greek and Roman knowledge. They were building on it, extending it, transforming it. Al-Khwarizmi formalized algebra as a mathematical discipline. Ibn al-Haytham wrote a treatise on optics that would not be surpassed in Europe for half a millennium. Physicians in the Islamic world were performing complex surgeries, establishing public hospitals, and compiling pharmacological texts that synthesized Greek, Persian, and Indian medical traditions. In China, the Tang dynasty was producing innovations in printing, navigation, metallurgy, ceramics, and public administration. Block printing was developed, enabling the mass reproduction of texts centuries before the European printing press. The compass was refined for maritime navigation. A sophisticated civil service examination system created one of the earliest meritocratic bureaucracies in history. Poetry and painting flourished at a level of refinement that had few parallels anywhere in the world. In India, mathematicians were perfecting the decimal place value system and the concept of zero, achievements so fundamental that every computation performed by every computer, every financial transaction, every engineering calculation in the modern world rests upon them, and these civilizations were not sealed off from each other or from Europe. Trade routes connected them. The Silk Road carried goods and ideas from China to the Mediterranean. Arab merchants and scholars traveled freely between Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and the ports of the Indian Ocean. Knowledge circulated through these networks. Texts were translated from Greek to Arabic, from Arabic to Persian, from Sanskrit to Arabic. The intellectual world was large, connected, and dynamic. European scholars began absorbing this body of knowledge in earnest during the 12th and 13th centuries through translation centers in Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked in proximity. The arrival of complete Aristotelian texts in Latin, many of them translated from Arabic rather than Greek, because the Arabic versions were the ones that had been most carefully preserved, sparked a philosophical revolution in the new European universities. Medical knowledge from the Islamic world reshaped European practice. Mathematical concepts from India, transmitted through Arab scholars, provided the tools for what would eventually become modern science. The Renaissance, a few centuries later, was built in substantial part on this cross-cultural foundation. It was not, as the popular story suggests, a spontaneous awakening of the European mind after 1,000 years of sleep. It was the delayed absorption of knowledge that had been circulating elsewhere for centuries. Knowledge that was available, that was moving through networks to which Europe had been connected all along, but that had been slow to cross the particular institutional and linguistic barriers that characterized the European intellectual landscape during this period. This reframes the standard narrative in an important way. The darkness was not a global condition. It was a local one, and it was not caused primarily by the loss of knowledge. It was caused, in significant part, by the conditions under which knowledge was stored, accessed, and permitted to circulate in one particular corner of the world. And even within that corner, the reality was more complex than the label permits. Because Europe during the so-called Dark Ages was not as intellectually barren as the popular image suggests. Within the constraints of the institutional environment I have been describing, genuine innovation was taking place. The heavy plough I mentioned at the beginning was one example. The three-field crop rotation system was another, a technique that increased food production by allowing land to be used more efficiently, and that spread across northern Europe during the early medieval centuries. Watermills and windmills were adapted and multiplied, providing mechanical power for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and processing other materials. These innovations may sound humble compared to the grand intellectual achievements of the Islamic world or the Tang dynasty, but their cumulative effect on the lives of millions of people was enormous. They increased food supplies, supported larger populations, generated the surplus wealth that eventually funded the construction of cathedrals, the founding of universities, and the growth of towns. And the cathedrals themselves deserve more than a passing mention. The great Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries are among the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. The builders of Chartres, of Amiens, of Cologne, of Notre Dame solved complex structural problems involving weight distribution, light management, and acoustic design with a sophistication that still impresses modern engineers. They did this without formal engineering degrees, without computers, without many of the mathematical tools that later centuries would develop. They did it through accumulated practical knowledge, passed down through guilds and master-apprentice relationships, refined through trial and error over generations. This is knowledge. It is not the same kind of knowledge that fills a library. It is embodied knowledge, carried in hands and eyes and habits of craft. And it is precisely the kind of knowledge that the written record tends to underrepresent, because the people who possessed it were rarely the people who wrote things down. The universities that appeared in the 12th century at Bologna, Paris, Oxford, grew out of cathedral schools that had been developing for generations. They were, in most cases, church-sponsored institutions, and within them, scholars produced work of genuine intellectual depth. Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy in a way that shaped Western thought for centuries. Roger Bacon wrote about experimental method with a rigor that anticipated later scientific revolutions. Hildegard of Bingen produced medical and scientific texts alongside her better-known theological and musical work. These were not the products of an intellectually dead civilization. They were the products of a civilization that was active and creative, working within the particular constraints and opportunities that its institutional environment provided. The picture, in short, is far more complicated than the label Dark Ages permits. There was genuine loss. There was also genuine creation. There was narrowing, but also deepening in certain directions. The era was not dark. It was, if anything, unevenly lit, bright in some areas, dim in others, and cast in a very particular color by the institution that held the lamp. There is a theory that pushes the implications to its most extreme conclusion. It is called the phantom time hypothesis, proposed in 1991 by a German writer named Heribert Illig. And I want to mention it not because it is credible, because it is not, but because the way it fails is illuminating. Illig's claim was that roughly 297 years of the early Middle Ages, from about 614 to 911 AD, were entirely fabricated, made up. He argued that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II conspired to insert fictional centuries into the calendar so that their reigns would coincide with the year 1000. The hypothesis is wrong. Decisively, demonstrably wrong. Astronomical records from China, the Islamic world, and Byzantium document celestial events during the supposedly phantom centuries, and modern calculations confirm that these events occurred exactly when the conventional timeline says they did. Dendrochronology provides a continuous tree ring record with no gap. Archaeological remains from 3 continents fill the period with buildings, coins, tools, and human remains. For the theory to work, dozens of unconnected civilizations would have had to coordinate a deception of impossible scale. But Illig's theory attracted attention, and continues to attract attention, because it articulates a feeling that many people share. The feeling that the standard story of the Dark Ages does not add up. That the idea of a neat 1,000-year gap between Roman civilization and the Renaissance is too convenient, too tidy, too suspiciously useful to the people who promoted it. That feeling is not wrong. It is just pointed in the wrong direction. The record was shaped, not by a dramatic act of calendar fraud, but by the slow, cumulative, perfectly ordinary process of institutional curation that I have been describing. Century after century of selective copying, selective recording, selective emphasis. The result is a version of the past that is genuine in its parts, but misleading in its totality. Not forged, filtered. And filtering, it turns out, is much harder to detect than forgery. A forged document can be exposed through analysis. A missing document can at least be noticed by the gap it leaves. But a filtered record, one that is truthful in everything it says but shaped by what it omits, is almost invisible to anyone who does not know what to look for. It feels complete. It reads as coherent. The story makes sense, and it takes a particular kind of attention. Patient, curious, willing to ask, what is not here, to notice that the completeness is an illusion. This is why the Dark Ages narrative persisted so long despite the accumulating evidence against it. The narrative was not built on lies. It was built on a real but filtered record that, when viewed from a particular angle, appeared to support the story of total darkness. The documents were genuine. The thinness of the record was genuine. The conclusion drawn from these facts, that nothing of value happened during those centuries, was not supported by the evidence, but it felt supported. And feelings, in the life of a narrative, are often more powerful than facts. One of the most misleading aspects of the standard narrative is its treatment of the Renaissance as a sudden awakening, a clean break from darkness into light. The word Renaissance means rebirth. And the usual story goes like this. After 1,000 years of intellectual dormancy, European scholars rediscovered the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this rediscovery sparked an explosion of creativity that transformed the world. There is truth in the outline. The 14th through 16th centuries in Europe did see a remarkable flowering of art, science, and philosophy. But the framing conceals something important. Many of the classical texts that fueled the Renaissance had not been lost in the straightforward way the popular story implies. Some had been preserved in Western monasteries all along, sitting on shelves, accessible only to the monks who maintained the collections. Others had been preserved in Arabic translation in the libraries of the Islamic world, where they had been not only maintained, but studied, expanded, and built upon for centuries. The Renaissance was not Europe waking up from a dream. It was Europe finally absorbing a body of knowledge that had been available, circulating through other civilizations for a very long time. The process of absorption was driven by specific historical circumstances, new trade contacts, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which pushed Greek scholars westward, the growth of universities, and the development of printing. And there is a dimension to this that is less often discussed. The Church, and particularly the monastic orders, had been in possession of significant classical holdings throughout the Middle Ages. Not all of this material had been widely circulated. Some of it had been held in restricted collections. Some had been studied by a small number of approved scholars. Some had simply been stored and not studied at all. When the conditions of the 15th and 16th centuries created a new demand for classical knowledge, parts of this material began to emerge into wider circulation. The timing is worth thinking about. It coincided with a period when the Church was facing serious challenges to its authority, from internal reformers and external critics alike. The release of classical knowledge served, among other things, as a reminder that the Church had been the guardian of this intellectual heritage throughout the long centuries of its safekeeping. The Renaissance, seen in this light, was not just light breaking through darkness. It was also a story about when and how knowledge was made available, about the relationship between preservation and release, about the fact that storing knowledge and sharing knowledge are two very different acts, and that the decision about when to do the latter is itself a form of power, and there is something else about the Renaissance that the standard telling tends to gloss over. When classical knowledge began to circulate more widely in the 15th and 16th centuries, it did not simply arrive and get absorbed. It arrived into a world that had already been shaped for centuries by the Church's intellectual framework. Scholars who encountered Aristotle's complete works, or the medical texts of Galen, or the mathematical insights transmitted through Arabic scholarship, had to find ways to reconcile this material with the theological commitments that still structured their world. This produced some of the most creative intellectual work in European history. It also produced some of the most intense conflicts, because the classical tradition, in its full unfiltered form, contained ideas that did not sit comfortably with church doctrine. Aristotle's naturalism, his emphasis on observation and reasoning from evidence, pointed toward a way of understanding the world that did not require divine revelation as its starting point. Greek materialist philosophy suggested that the universe might be governed by impersonal natural laws rather than by a personal God. Medical and astronomical knowledge from the Islamic world had been developed within a different religious framework entirely. The Church's response to this influx was characteristically dual. It embraced the parts that could be assimilated, most famously through Thomas Aquinas's synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, and it resisted, sometimes violently, the parts that could not. The Index of Forbidden Books, established in 1559, was one tool for managing this tension. The Inquisition was another. The trials of Galileo and Bruno, which I mentioned earlier, were products of this specific historical moment. The collision between a body of knowledge that had been preserved and controlled for centuries and the unsettling implications of its full, unfiltered release. The Renaissance was not a clean break from darkness to light. It was the messy, sometimes violent process of an entire civilization trying to absorb knowledge that had been kept at arm's length for a very long time. The light was real. The creativity was real. But the conditions that produced the Renaissance were inseparable from the conditions that had preceded it. The same institution that had kept the knowledge alive had also kept it contained. And when the containment began to fail, the results were transformative and painful in roughly equal measure. The Dark Ages narrative has proven remarkably durable, and it has endured not through inertia alone, but through a series of reinforcing mechanisms that are worth understanding. The most powerful of these was the standardization of public education in the 19th century. When European nation-states built mass schooling systems, they needed a master narrative for history, a story that could be taught to millions of children, printed in textbooks, absorbed as common knowledge. The story they chose was the one that served their purposes best, a clean, linear progression from ancient greatness through medieval darkness to modern light. Each era received its label, its color, its moral weight. This was not disinterested scholarship. It was nation-building. The European powers of the 19th century needed a story that justified their global dominance, their industrial transformations, their imperial ambitions. The Dark Ages narrative provided exactly that. If the past was dark, the present was bright by contrast. If the medieval world was ignorant and superstitious, the modern world's commitment to science and reason was not just admirable, but historically destined. Once embedded in textbooks, the narrative became self-sustaining. Teachers taught it because it was the curriculum. Students absorbed it as settled fact. They grew up and reproduced it as filmmakers, novelists, politicians, commentators. The Middle Ages became not just a historical period, but a metaphor. Calling something medieval became a way of calling it primitive. Film and television amplified the effect. Nearly every popular depiction of the Middle Ages follows the same visual grammar. Gray skies, mud, brutality, ignorant peasants cowering before an omnipresent church. These images have been repeated so many times that they function like memories. People feel as though they know what the Middle Ages looked like, even though what they actually know is what Hollywood decided the Middle Ages should look like, based on a 19th century narrative, based on an 18th century philosophical argument, based on a 14th century poet's complaint about Latin prose. The layering is remarkable, and the persistence is not accidental. The story endures because it is useful. It flatters the present by diminishing the past. It provides a simple moral framework that requires no nuance, and it demands nothing of its audience except passive acceptance. There is one more element of this story that I keep returning to. It has to do with the Vatican's own archives. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, is one of the largest historical document collections on Earth. It spans roughly 12 centuries, held on approximately 85 kilometers of shelving, more than 50 miles of documents, papal correspondence, diplomatic records, trial transcripts, financial accounts, personal journals, maps. The word secret in the old name was a mistranslation of the Latin secretum, meaning private or separate. The archive was the Pope's personal administrative collection. In 2019, Pope Francis renamed it to clear up the confusion. Since 1881, qualified scholars have been permitted access, though the process is restricted. You need institutional credentials, a formal research proposal, and approval. Some periods remain off-limits. Over 1,000 researchers visit annually. Their work has produced important scholarship, but the archive's sheer scale and its old name have made it a natural target for speculation. Some of that speculation is reasonable. The archive almost certainly contains material that would enrich or complicate existing historical narratives. Scholars who have gained access have found exactly that. What the archive does not contain, almost certainly, is a single revelatory document that would overturn the history of the Dark Ages. Not because the Church is above suspicion, but because history is not reshaped by single documents. It is reshaped by decades and centuries of institutional behavior, by the accumulation of ordinary decisions about what to preserve, teach, emphasize, and fund. That process is visible in its effects even when its individual steps are too mundane to attract attention. The archive matters not as a vault of secrets, but as a physical embodiment of the principle that runs through this entire story. Institutions accumulate memory. They control access to it. And in doing so, they shape what the rest of the world is able to know about its own past. Not through conspiracy, through structure. Perhaps the deepest thing this entire subject teaches is something about knowledge itself and how fragile it really is. We tend to assume that once something is known, it stays known. That knowledge accumulates like sediment, building up layer by layer. That each generation inherits a slightly richer intellectual landscape than the one before. But that assumption is wrong. Knowledge is not a substance that persists on its own. It is a practice, a living process that requires institutions to support it, people to transmit it, and communities to value it. When those supports fail, knowledge can vanish with extraordinary speed. Roman concrete is a famous example. The Romans had a formula for concrete so durable that structures built with it are still standing after 2,000 years. modern engineers have only recently begun to understand the chemistry that made it so resilient. And yet, within a century or two of the empire's collapse, the knowledge of how to make it was gone. Not because someone destroyed the formula, not because the church forbade it, because the conditions that sustained the practice, the quarries, the trade networks, the construction crews, the apprenticeship systems, fell apart. And without those conditions, the knowledge simply evaporated. That same process happened in varying degrees across hundreds of fields. Techniques in metalwork, glassmaking, hydraulic engineering, road construction, advanced stoneworking. In each case, the knowledge was real. It had been developed over centuries. It worked, and it disappeared, not through any dramatic act of destruction, but through the quiet, inglorious failure of the systems that kept it alive. This, I think, is the real lesson of the so-called Dark Ages. Not that someone deliberately plunged a continent into darkness, not that a sinister institution smothered the light of reason, but that knowledge is more fragile than we like to believe, that it depends on conditions that are easy to take for granted and hard to rebuild once they are gone. That progress is not a ratchet, clicking forward one notch at a time and never slipping back. It is more like a flame that requires constant tending, and when the tending stops, for whatever reason, economic collapse, institutional narrowing, political fragmentation, the flame does not just dim. Given enough time, it can go out entirely. The church was both the tender and the lens adjuster during those centuries. It kept certain flames alive with extraordinary devotion, and it allowed others to gutter and die through the ordinary exercise of institutional priority. These are not contradictions. They are two aspects of the same reality. And this dynamic is not merely a relic of the medieval world. It persists, in different forms, in our own time. We live in an era where knowledge is, once again, mediated by powerful institutions. The nature of those institutions has changed. They are no longer monasteries and cathedral schools. They are universities, technology companies, media organizations, publishing houses, government agencies. But the underlying structure is familiar. Knowledge is produced, stored, curated, and distributed by institutions that have their own priorities, their own values, their own criteria for what matters and what does not. When a search algorithm decides which information appears at the top of a results page and which is effectively invisible, that is curation. When a school curriculum devotes a full semester to one period of history and compresses another into a single paragraph, that is curation. When a publishing industry decides which kinds of stories are commercially viable and which are not, that is curation. None of these are conspiracies. Most of them are not even fully conscious decisions. They are structural. They are the natural product of institutions operating according to their own logic. And over time, their cumulative effect is to shape what we know, what we think is important, and what we never think to ask about. The Dark Ages narrative itself is a product of exactly this process. It was not a lie. It was a curation, a particular way of organizing a vast, complicated historical reality into a story that was simple enough to teach, satisfying enough to remember, and useful enough to keep repeating. And it persisted for centuries, not because it was the most accurate version of the past, but because it served the purposes of the people and institutions that kept it in circulation. Recognizing that does not mean we should distrust everything we have been taught. It means we should hold what we have been taught with a certain lightness, a willingness to ask, not with paranoia, but with genuine curiosity, What parts of this story were chosen and what parts were left out? Not because the people who chose were acting in bad faith, but because choosing is what institutions do, and the choices, accumulated over enough time, become invisible. They stop looking like choices and start looking like reality. So where does all of this leave us? The Dark Ages were not what the name suggests. They were not a blank space in human history. They were a long, complicated, regionally varied period of transformation, during which some things were genuinely lost and other things were quietly built. During which one institution accumulated extraordinary influence over the intellectual life of a continent and used that influence to both preserve and shape the knowledge available to an entire civilization. And during which the rest of the world, far from standing still, was producing some of the most significant intellectual achievements in human history. The label Dark Ages tells us more about the people who invented it and the purposes it served than about the era it describes. It was useful to Petrarch, to Protestant reformers, to Enlightenment philosophers, to 19th century nation builders, and in a strange way, even to the church itself. Each group found something in the metaphor that served its narrative, and so the metaphor survived long after the scholarship moved on. What remains, when you strip away the label, is something more interesting than either the myth of total darkness or the counter-myth of deliberate suppression. What remains is a question about how knowledge endures and how it disappears, about how institutions shape memory, about how the version of the past we inherit is always a selection, always a curation, always a reflection of someone's priorities, and about how much patience and honesty it takes to look past the inherited version and see the more complicated reality underneath. That process of looking past inherited versions is not unique to the study of the Middle Ages. It is relevant to every piece of history we carry with us, every era we have named, every story we have been told about how we got from there to here. The names we give to periods of time are never neutral. They carry judgments, they embed assumptions, they make some things visible and render others invisible. And the only real protection against their distorting power is the willingness to examine them, carefully and without hurry, and to ask whose interests they serve. The medieval world was messy, creative, contradictory, and far more alive than the old stereotype permits. It contained genuine darkness and genuine light, often in the same institution, often in the same century, often on the same shelf. It was a human era, shaped by human decisions, and it is still not fully understood. Perhaps it never will be, and perhaps that is fine. Perhaps the value of looking at it closely is not in arriving at a final answer, but in developing the habit of looking, of noticing when a story is too clean, of asking who benefits from the cleanness, of sitting with complexity rather than reaching for the nearest satisfying label. If this kind of slow, patient thinking has been worth your time tonight, I am glad you stayed with it. And you are welcome back here anytime you feel like taking another quiet walk through a subject that does not have a neat ending. The past is patient. It is not going anywhere. Good night.